but
All right. So hopefully everybody can hear me. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Let me share my
screen here. Oh, sharing is not turned on.
hold on, I got you. I see you, but why isn't it?
I
can send a request if that's me to send a request.
I got it.
Okay. Oh, I'm the host now. Look at that.
And when you get a chance, can you mute yourself?
Thought I did.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. All right, so everybody can hear me then on this camera, and then the folks that are here in the room. All right, well, thanks for coming in today. We're gonna talk a little bit about the vacant land purchase agreement. I will say this agreement is not perfect. There are a few things in here that are clunky and that I don't really care for, but unfortunately it is the most updated version that we have. I solicit any of your feedback to say if you've seen a better one, or if there's something that we can add to this, or you would like to see differently. One of the things I am gonna add is on the last page, I'm gonna add to it, the buyer broker compensation agreement, because I feel like a lot of agents are missing that document when they're used to having it with a purchase agreement, but for some reason it's getting skipped on. So I will add that, and I'm just gonna add it as another page. It won't be part of the agreement, but it'll all be in one, so you don't have to worry about going over and finding the buyer broker compensation agreement along with this. So that's one of the changes that we'll be making here relatively soon. All right, so as far as the vacant land purchase agreement goes, we'll just go through it just like I normally do on the other purchase agreements, as far as block by block. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. Keep your stories to a minimum, because I know that that gets a little bit out of hand, and agents are like, hey, I just need to get through the class, and then we can tell the stories at the end. So if there's anything about that. All right, so first paragraph, pretty standard. I mean, it's going to be, you know, whoever your buyer is on line one, or buyers, if you have multiple, if it's an LLC or a trust, that's what goes on line one. And then the vacant land located at on line two. Now, this can get a little bit tricky just because sometimes there's not an address on the vacant land that you're trying to make an offer on. There's a permanent parcel number. I know that MLS requires the permanent parcel number, but it might just say, like, I had vacant land on Parkford Street, and it didn't have an address. And so it was just vacant land on Parkford Street. And so you just want to be a little bit creative, I would say, on line two. If it doesn't have an address, you're going to put vacant land on whatever street it might be on. And then you're always going to put the permanent parcel number in there on line three, or parcel numbers if there's more than one. But it's really just a general overall description of what the property is that the person's buying. I actually had one once where they were splitting the parcel, and it didn't have individual parcel numbers yet. So we had to put the parcel number that was available on all 40 acres. And then on the additional line at the end, we had to write that it was only for 20 of those 40 acres pending the final survey. So sometimes you have to get a little bit creative with these, and it's a little tricky, call with questions. Because even though we try our best to be very specific, we're not attorneys and we can't always protect everybody when we're writing in additional information. So that's some things about the first paragraph. And then the second paragraph is really also include and not include. There typically aren't things on vacant land that you're including, but there could be an outdoor building perhaps that was already there, maybe a house burnt down and they listed it as vacant land instead of residential, or they demolished the property or whatever the case is. So if there is something else, you can always include that and then not include it. But just remember, lenders do not like chattel on their purchase agreements. So you'll always want to do that separately. And then if it's a secondary offer, lines 9 through 13, kind of like our regular purchase agreement. So if the buyer, if the land is already under contract and you're making a secondary offer on this, then you would complete that section, putting a date in there. It is or is not a secondary offer, and then you would put the date in there that it would become an active contract. And then of course, lines 14, 15, that is going to be the purchase price. And then you have the earnest money amount and cash down payment. So if they are financing the property, what is the balance of the cash that would be in there? So if we're offering, $100,000 on this line and the earnest money is 1,000, then we might be putting down 20%. So we're going to put $20,000 or 19,000 perhaps if you're using $1,000 of the earnest money. So it just depends on how you want to complete that. And then the mortgage loan would go on line 20 if they are getting a mortgage on that. One thing to note is there are vacant land lenders and then there are residential home lenders. They don't often cross over. Sometimes they do. I don't know if our lenders here at Cross Country or Keller Home Loans offer vacant land. Usually it's very specific, not from them. It's a lender that's very specific. And then also, is it over 5 acres? Because that can make a difference too. All right, and then is it a conventional loan, cash, or any other type of financing? Lines 21 through 23 just say that if it's over $10,000 in earnest money, that you have to send that electronically. You can't have a paper check anymore. So we're thankful that that's up to $10,000, because there for a while it was like $1,000, and that was kind of a nightmare, because there are still a lot of people that like to write a check or go to the bank and get a cashier's check. So it's always best if they deposit it directly with the title company and it is a cashier's check or it's a wire. Those are the two best ways. Personal checks take longer to clear. And so, they might hold that for 10 days at the bank. And so if you're doing a 14-day close, I do not recommend a cash or anything other than a wire. So especially not a personal check. And then financing. So it would be contingent upon a buyer financing if you use this section, line 25 through 28. And you would just say that they would have a written loan application within blank days. Now, typically that's 5 days. We usually say within 3 to 5 days, there should be no reason that a person can't make a written loan application at their bank within that time frame. Yes, they may have a pre-approval, but we want to make sure they actually do a written loan application that starts the process. So that's typically going to be a 3 to 5 day window on line 25. And then it would say on or about the blank date on line 26 for a loan commitment. The loan commitment should be within 3 to 5 days of the closing date. So if you do a 30-day close, then you would put that date in there, maybe 25, date number 25. So whatever that would be. So today being, the 20th. So then we would just add 25 days to that, and that's what we would put in that section for the date. And then closing, this section is a little bit different than what we typically see on our purchase agreement. I do like this, and I wish that we kept it on our purchase agreement, and I'll give you the reasons why. But basically, it would just say that all of the funds would be placed into escrow with the lending institution or the title company. So that's going to be line 30 is your title company. So let's just say it's American Title Solutions, and then it would be on or before. So let's say that we want to close by the end of next month. Well, there are 2 dates here. And the reason for that is because the first date is when the title company would have everything they need. They have all the information from the lender. They have all the information from you as the agent, escrow letter. They have all the information that they have from the buyer or seller. In order to make sure that they can close on time. So that first date is kind of like the date that all the documents and everything is ready to be closed, but we're not closing yet. And then the second date is when you actually want to close on the property and have title transfer. So it's really nice, instead of all of us rushing for that last day to get everything in and get it closed, you have a buffer there. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, because I know it's a little bit different than what we're typically used to. And then possession, which is kind of strange to have on a purchase agreement. However, there could be reasons why possession, let's say, for example, you're buying vacant land where a farmer has already planted their crops and they are going to harvest that crop within the next 60 days. Well, you might not get possession of that property until the 90-day mark or after the 60 days when they've harvested the property. Even though you have ownership of it, you are actually not taking over that property because maybe that tenant farmer has the right to get those crops out of the ground, or perhaps it was, used as storage, and so there's a reason for that. So it seems odd on possession, but there are reasons for it to be on there and not always applicable. All right. And then for title, again, this would be where you're going to get your title insurance from. So it's typically going to be the same as number 30, line 30 and 39 are going to be the same. So much like our purchase agreement that you see where we have the title company will be and the escrow agent will be, this is just in two different sections, but it's the same company. Doesn't have to be, but it typically is. Okay. All right. And then prorations, one of the things on vacant land that you have to be very aware of is the agricultural tax recoupment. So I disagree typically that the seller would have to pay this, but the reason that the seller has to end up holding the money unless you can negotiate something different is, let's say that you have a buyer that's buying 40 acres of land and the buyer says, I'm going to build a house on it. I want this to be residential property. I don't want to farm it and I'm not going to get an agricultural tax reduction. Well, the seller has farmed it all these years and they get their tax reduction. So the taxes are $200 a year compared to $2,400, let's just say, a year. And so what happens is the new buyer will have to apply for that each year that they're there if they chose to have the agricultural tax recoupment. Again, in my scenario, they're not going to. They're saying, I don't want to do that. Well, the county has the right to go back for the last 2 years and tax that land at the new tax rate. I think the buyer should be responsible for that personally. However, because taxes are in the rears, that is why the seller would typically pay it, because they were owning that land and responsible for it for the last 2 years. And unfortunately, the buyer doesn't take over until closing. So it is negotiable, but I will tell you in most contracts, or at least in ours for sure, it is the seller that's paying it. So be very careful if you're on the receiving end of that. Know what the buyer's intentions are. And even if you don't know what the buyer's intentions are, you're relying on that buyer to file that for the next year. Otherwise, your seller may have to pay it. So be very careful. Yes.
How do you find out if there is something owed? Like, as far as the CAUB?
The title company.
Okay,
So
not until you go under contract?
and when you go under contract, depending upon what you negotiate in the contract, the title company will then say, we're gonna set aside X amount of dollars. We've talked to the county, they've estimated the tax to be this at this value, and this is how much money we're gonna have to hold from the seller. So we don't know the amount until you actually go under contract, unless perhaps there's a way that you can say to a title company before you get started, oh, well, I'm gonna, we have a list price of $90,000. Can you contact the county to see what that would look like? Then you might know up front, but typically a title company doesn't get involved until we have a contract.
Can the seller just like call the county, be like?
Sure, the seller could probably call the
Yeah.
county.
Okay,
You're just relying on that information for the buyer, which is a little scary because the buyer is hoping that the seller is telling the truth. And if the seller is saying it's 90, let's just say, it's $2,500 and I'm not paying it. I mean, they might say, well, it was only $2,000 when I called, right? You want to be the source of the source. So it's relying on a seller to get that information. I don't know that I would trust that. I would probably have my favorite title company person reach out, or I would do it myself
okay.
personally. So, but it is not, we will not know the amount until you know what the purchase price is. So that's why I'm saying you can get an estimated amount from a seller calling, because I could list it at 90,000. But until we actually have a contract that says who's gonna pay it, we don't know who's gonna pay it either.
Okay.
So just be aware of that. I would say with any questions with agricultural tax, talk to your favorite title company. If you've got vacant land, before you write an offer on it, ask the question, what does this look like? All right. And then charges and escrow instructions. So this is very typical where we say that, you know, the title work is going to be done and the escrow officer is gonna check, you know, the seller is gonna be responsible for the real estate transfer tax, any amount required to discharge any mortgages or liens, all the typical things that we would typically, you know, have. And then also, 1/2 the cost of the insuring premium, which is the title insurance premium. So half of that split between the buyer and the seller, and also a location survey and half the escrow as well as the broker's commission. So, I'm sorry, that's the buyer that is paying those amounts. As far as the commission goes, and then location survey, that's all on the buyer. The seller would pay any utilities and like I said, half of the cost of the title insurance policy itself and then tax prorations. So very standard, very normal to what we're used to on a residential purchase. Nothing too different there, but always make sure that you understand, you know, are the taxes going to increase, and let your buyer know that, because not all buyers understand that the taxes will probably increase once they purchase something, especially on vacant land, depending upon the use that they're looking to use it for. Okay. All right, and then inspections. I will tell you, I don't know why our attorney, and I even asked her and she really didn't have a good answer on line 80, why it says title. I'm hoping to get that changed relatively soon, but I have no idea why she put in there title for an inspection. We already have a whole title section that says what is going to be looked at. So I can't even begin to tell you why. And when we looked at this, I don't recall seeing that in there. I would have questioned it, I hope. But clearly one of us or both of us missed it, and here we are, we have it. So the only thing I would say there is we did add pin or boundary survey. I think that was a problem because there's a significant difference between the cost of a pin survey and a boundary survey. And sometimes you don't even know that you need a new boundary survey until you're in the contract, because maybe the county red stamped the deed and said it's been too long since it's had a survey, a full survey done. So we won't transfer the property until you have a confirmed legal description and a new survey. That does sometimes happen. We used to see that quite a bit early in my career, especially in Carroll County. We don't see that too much on plots of land that have been bought and sold on a regular basis. But if you've got a piece of land that hasn't been sold in many, many years, and it's quite a decent amount of acreage, don't be surprised if the county requires a pin or a boundary survey rather, which again is going to be a lot more expensive. So make sure you understand who's paying for that, roughly possibly the cost, and you just never know if it's going to need done. So I always recommend a pin or a boundary survey checkbox when you're purchasing land, unless perhaps it's maybe like a parcel that's 50 foot wide by 150 that's in a platted development. That might be a little different. They're probably never going to require another survey done on something like that. But a large plot of land, chances are they're going to require it. And the time frame on that, by the way, too, is quite extensive. Sometimes it can take a couple months to find a surveyor that has the time and the availability to get out there. So just make sure you don't put like a 10-day quick boundary survey if one's necessary. All right, and then soil testing. Soil testing is typically done because you are going to be putting in a septic or a well. Now, sometimes it's also for whether you're gonna, God bless you, if you're building a house because you want to know the soil that the house is going to be built on. Can I put my house where I want it and it's not going to sink in the ground? So soil testing is typically very important if they're looking at buying and building on that land. Again, we're going to skip over title. And then the well report. So if there is a well, sometimes, like I mentioned to you, there are vacant land properties that are listed in the MLS because the home burnt down and there's only a barn, but there might be a well and septic as, you know, with the property as well. So we did put a well report. Or sometimes it's a hunting cabin that's not really, it doesn't have an address. It's just a cabin, but they have a well. So that's why that's in there. Zoning, very important. Make sure that, you know, I'll give you an example. I'm on Jackson Township Zoning Commission. We had a lady and her husband that have been business owners in the township for a very long time. Business is in a B3 zone. It's a very large area, meaning it has to be industrial or commercial businesses in that zone. There are homes along there that are used as non-conforming use. They were built as a house when all that was zoned for commercial use, but because they've always been used as a home, they're allowed to be. But these folks just came to the zoning, paid their $700 zoning fee and said, oh, well, I'm assuming you're gonna rezone my 4 acres because I see houses in the front of my property, or I see houses in the front where my property isn't, but they own it. And we turned down the zoning because in the zoning book, those people that own those parcels that are much, much smaller, this person owns a 4-acre parcel. But there are houses there, there has to be a 70-foot setback from any building to the property line in those zones. So if we had rezoned what these folks thought was gonna be an easy rezone, which was just simple, hey, I see other houses along this area, I know it's zoned commercial, but we're gonna build a house back here. Those parcel owners, if they ever decided to use them as business, even though they're houses, they would have to demolish those buildings and they would never be able to build anything because they have to be 70 foot away from the property line. They were only 50 by 100-foot lots. We would have damaged what they would be able to do with their property for the future use. That's why zoning is important. So you want to make sure that whatever your person is buying, there is zoning, or not zoning, depends on the township that you're in. Because we do have like Osnaburg Township, half of it is zoned and half of it isn't. So make sure you understand what the intended use is for the vacant land that your buyer is purchasing, just because the zoning, if they buy it and you check this box, oh, zoning, and we're gonna have 10 days to do the inspection, I'm gonna tell you your 10 days is probably not anywhere near long enough. Because if it's in Jackson Township, they only meet once a month. And that's if there's a zoning application and it has to be by a certain time to have a meeting that month. So you might be looking at 2 months. So please make sure you understand that when it comes to zoning, this is not a number of days of 10 or 20. It could be as much as 60 or 90. Okay. And then any other, oh, go ahead.
Is there somewhere you can find like a zoning map?
Yeah, there is, as on Stark County, there is a zoning map. There's an overlay on the GIS site that you can see all the zoning. Yes. Now, when you get specific to an area, the best thing to do would be to call the township or municipality that land is located in and ask the zoning inspector to send you the map. Because as much as those maps could change, we want to make sure we're giving the most up-to-date information. So I don't know that I would rely on the GIS map as far as a whole, but it will give you a general idea. Okay, so call the municipality. Yeah, and then any other inspections that you might require, somebody might say, well, what other inspections would I want? Well, it just depends on what the intended use is of the land that you're doing. I don't know. Are you building a barn dominium? Is that allowed? Are you building a house? Are you building just a barn? There are some townships that, if you don't have a primary dwelling, you can't build a garage on. So those would be things that you need to understand. So checking other might be any other inspections you're not aware of yet that you might need.
So if somebody's buying land and it's zoned agricultural.
Yeah.
But they wanna build on it,
Mhm.
do you have, you have to get zoning involved at that point because it's not zoned residential or?
So you should get zoning involved only because agricultural land is usually, it has to be a minimum of X amount of acres. So it depends on what your buyer's intended use is for it. Let's say it's 20 acres, but they say, yeah, I want to buy all 20 acres, but I don't want to pay the tax on all 20 acres. So I'm going to leave 15 acres of it agricultural and 5 acres I want for my house. Well, zoning may need to be involved in that just to understand which 5 acres are going to be zoned residential versus agricultural.
Okay.
Because if it's all agricultural around there, they may not do a spot zone and allow that to be changed to residential. So you just never know. So it's always good to get zoning involved whenever somebody comes. Like I said, I felt terrible. I mean, this lady came up to the podium and said, I wasn't prepared to speak, but we always invite the applicant up to speak. And she said, we've already gone through all the plans. I've picked my builder. We've done everything and we're here to get zoning. And it's like, yikes. The answer is no. And, we don't have the final say as the zoning commission, the trustees do, but I mean, we follow the book that's in front of us. So I would just say, even if you think it's a slam dunk, it may not be a slam dunk. So I'll give you another example that recently happened. There is a plot of land on Portage Street, which we're all probably familiar with Portage Street. There are plenty of multifamily units on that street, duplex properties. Well, zoning must have changed in Jackson Township over 26 years ago because the current zoning inspector that's there, she has been there 26 years and she doesn't understand this either. But we had an applicant come to us. There was a duplex, a vacant lot, and then a single family home. Well, across the street, there are multifamily buildings and duplex properties, so it would fit that they could put a duplex there. Well, there was a disagreement on the zoning commission amongst what we should do, because those two spots that have duplexes on them are actually still zoned as single family rural residential. We don't know how they have duplexes on them, but they're zoned rural residential. So the applicant came forward with a rural residential, but by today's code or today's zoning rules, that would have to be multifamily. It'd have to be R2. Well, there are no other R2s on that side of the street in that block. So it almost looks like spot zoning. So that's a really tough situation. So that's why I say, just because it looks obvious that there's a duplex next door and you think that you should be able to do it, don't assume that. And make sure your buyer is the one calling the zoning commission. You can assist them with that, but let them hear it directly from the zoning themselves. You always want to be the source of the source, not the source for someone. All right, so the little stories just kind of help explain why it's so important for the zoning and other items. And then the waiver, the buyer would just initial any of those inspections that they've checked no to, they don't have the right to do. But the ones that they have checked yes to, they absolutely can do. All right. And then, of course, just like our purchase agreement, our regular residential purchase agreement, after each inspection, after each inspection is completed, the buyer will then have 3 days to elect either accepting it, asking the seller to make repairs, or something previously not disclosed that came up during the inspection report. Maybe they can't put a well and septic in, maybe they can't get the zoning that they want, then they can get out of the contract. Okay. Megan's Law is just the same as it is on a residential purchase agreement. You know, if a seller gets a postcard in the mail that says that there's a sexual offender or predator, disclose it. But otherwise, it's not the seller's duty to disclose that there's a sexual offender or predator in the area. Get on the county sheriff's website of wherever that land is located, and that will tell you if there are any sexual predators or offenders or anything like that in there. If you have never done it yourself, if you've never gone on the website in the county that you live in and looked and put in your address, do it. It's quite scary. You would be surprised how many sexual offenders are out there, even in your own community, that you don't realize. They're kind of everywhere. So I encourage you to do that. And also it's scary, so you know, be careful. The condition of the property just says that the buyer has examined the condition of the property and they're purchasing it as is. You're going to see that in multiple areas in this purchase agreement. It's as is. It does talk about the vacant land, the seller's vacant land disclosure. That disclosure is not required by Ohio law. Okay, the residential property disclosure form is required by law on residential property, but on vacant land, there is a vacant land document that we have available for disclosure, but it is not required. You cannot make a seller fill that document out. So just be prepared when you're filling out a purchase agreement, you may or may not have access to that document because it's not required. And then lines 115 through 119, it's either the buyer has or has not received a copy of that property disclosure form. And again, more often than not, you're going to be checking lines 117 through 119 that they have not received it because there isn't one. All right, and then lines 120 through 123, the seller will provide promptly the buyer with any copies or notices from government agencies, and they'll have X amount of days. So line 121 is number of days. You could say 3 days, 5 days, somewhere in there from the receipt of it in order to figure out what they might have to do. So let's say again that there was vacant land that the house burnt down, there's still a hole in the ground, and yet all of a sudden you're in a contract and the buyer and seller, or the seller gets a notice in the mail that says not zoning, but our building department has noticed that this property is still not cleaned up. You have X amount of days to clean it up or whatever. That's something the seller needs to disclose to the buyer. And then the buyer has to say, yes, I accept those terms, or no, I'm not buying it based on this new discovered information from the municipality. So that's why the number of days in there is important. I would recommend probably 5 days after receipt. 3 days might be a little bit short of a time frame, just because until the buyer knows what they're dealing with and can get some answers to the questions on the cost of what may need cleaned up or checked out. And then representations and disclaimers, again, it's saying that the seller has not promised anything. We as brokerages haven't promised anything. Everything is contained in this purchase agreement, and that the buyer has looked into whatever their intended use is. The seller is not saying, oh yeah, you can build on here, but the buyer hasn't looked into it. The buyer should be looking into it. They're not relying on the seller's representations or any kind of disclaimers on behalf of the listing agent or the seller. And then whatever addendums would be, if there is a house sale contingency, perhaps maybe somebody is building their dream home, they have to sell their current home in order to close on this land, so that's why you would see a house sale concurrency or contingency in there. The state of Ohio, of course, agency disclosure form is always required when you have a sale. And then a vacant land seller disclosure, again, optional if it's available, and then any others. Which might be something like the buyer broker compensation agreement that you might check other and put on line 134 if you felt compelled to do that. Line 136 through 138, I want to make it very clear that you only fill this section out in the event that you actually have received a check deposit from your buyer. So early on in my career, nobody told me that, and at Realty One, we had in our purchase agreement, it said, we would ask the question, well, how much earnest money are you going to put down? And they might say $500 or $1,000. We would fill out this section saying that we received the earnest money when in fact we had not received it. So the only way to fill this out is if you received the earnest money. Otherwise, you're going to put non-applicable in box 138 by office and phone number. They're all going to be non-applicable because you did not accept the earnest money. If you did, great. Have them fill it out to American Title Solutions. Put it in there, by Rich Cosgrove, office, Canton, Legacy Group, and my phone. Do you have a question, Megan? You look confused.
Most of the time I grab earnest money after an
Mhm.
accepted offer, so.
Totally normal that you do not collect earnest money until after you have a fully executed purchase agreement. Totally normal. That is not always the case. Like I said, back in the day when we did everything in person, we would collect the earnest money up front because a lot of times, if you notice, it's hard to get it from the buyer even when it's electronic. Once you get the house under contract, the buyer or the property under contract, I should say in this case, the buyer might ghost you and not give you the earnest money or might say, oh, I'll get it to you, but they never do. So getting it up front is not a bad thing. Worst case scenario, you give the check back to them or you shred it.
Okay.
But it's saying that you got it. So if there's ever a time I can get earnest money, I'm gonna get it right then. If I'm in person.
And then you don't have to,
You're not
go
chasing
back
anybody.
twice.
That's right. Yep. And again, worst case scenario, you're gonna show them something else so you can give them the check back.
Right.
So. Yep. And then again, it just says, talks about it being a binding agreement and that days is defined as calendar days. It is not business days, they're calendar days, which is nice. So that keeps you understanding that the weekends count. It's calendar days. It doesn't say anything about holidays. It is calendar days. So make sure that is this distinguished difference between some of the purchase agreements, because our other purchase agreement or listing agreement often will exclude weekends and holidays as far as getting it in the MLS and things like that. So just know the difference. This is calendar days. All right, and then it would be duration of the offer. We did leave that in there, and so it would just say that's when your offer expires. It doesn't mean the seller has to reply to you by then, just means that your buyer's offer expires during that time frame. Now, the seller can still sign this, and if the buyer wants to honor that, they can still honor it and they can move forward. But if the buyer has made an offer on another property because this seller didn't get back to them, and the seller sends back this after the expiration date, you don't have a valid contract. Okay, so that's what that date is there for. And then, of course, you just get the buyer's signature, seller's signature on it, and then the multiple listing information, who the agent is and what their license number is. Why? Because the title company requires that as part of their closing packet. So that's why those are important. And then, like I said, there's nothing on here that talks about commission. There's nothing in here that talks about the additional commission. That is what the buyer broker compensation agreement is for. So like I said, we will add that to this so you don't forget it. But also, you still have to have a written buyer agency agreement with vacant land purchasers, and you want to make sure that it's outlined whatever compensation you're getting is in there. So do we have any general questions about the vacant land purchase agreement? Anything that you've seen that you would prefer it to be added or dislike? Any comments or questions? Super easy. Okay. Well, the vacant land purchase agreement was requested that we go over it. So that's why I have held the class today. We do have another 30 minutes-ish. If you guys have any additional questions about any other forms or just anything in general, since we do have the time. If you don't, you'll get a half hour of your day back. But if you do, I'm happy to answer questions.
Super random,
Sure.
but is a residential property disclosure required for a mobile?
It is not. A residential property disclosure form is not required for a mobile home because a mobile home is not considered real estate.
Okay.
Now, I answer that question to say if it's like in a park or if it's on rented or leased land, that is the case. It would also be true if it were on real estate that the mobile home owner also owns. In those instances, though, it gets a little bit tricky because then you're basically doing vacant land because the mobile home is considered personal property. But I see a lot of agents list it as residential because it is a mobile home. And in those instances, they do fill out the property disclosure form, but it's not required. It's still not required in those cases. But there's nothing that says that they can't fill it out. And I would always encourage a mobile home owner to fill out an RPD. If they know what's happened with the property, it's probably worth them disclosing it. The other thing I would say too is, there are a lot of modular or mobile homes that have been affixed to land because they have a basement. Those would be considered real estate in many cases. I have seen where some cases, I just learned here a couple weeks ago that a manufactured home on a foundation, they did not consider it as real estate and they needed, when I say they, the lender would lend on it as real estate. But in order to do that, they needed 2 comparisons in the appraisal to lend on that property that were also manufactured homes. So they couldn't compare one manufactured home to 3 stick-built homes. If it's a manufactured home, in the appraisal, they need at least 2 in order to make it valid. That was something that I learned, and I think that's something important for everybody, because when you go to do a modular home, if you can't find at least 2 other modulars within a decent distance or range that have sold, you might have trouble with the appraisal. So I share that with you because like I said, we just learned that and that was a little, the deal fell apart.
So like, let's say you've got 10 acres, and there's a mobile home on it.
Mhm.
And it's mobile, it's not attached.
Yep.
Like, let's say there's a driveway, does a driveway?
A driveway does
Like,
not
make a
mean it's
difference?
real estate. No, it doesn't make it at all. I mean, the mobile home itself will never be considered real estate unless it is on a fixed foundation. It doesn't have to have a basement, but it has to have a block or real solid foundation. That's the only way. And the only way to get it turned into real estate is you have to go to the auditor's office. You have to turn over the title to the mobile home in order to get a deed for the property. So there is a process to that. So if you ever go to a mobile home listing and the seller says, I have a title like a car title, it is not real estate.
But we can still list it.
But you can still list it as real estate. They give us that leeway. Because even the mobile homes in the parks, I've listed those myself too, and it's not considered real estate, but I still have them fill out a lead-based paint disclosure and an RPD. There's really no harm in taking that extra step and having them fill it out, but it is not considered real estate. Those, a lot of parks anymore don't even let real estate agents in. The park is the first one as an employee that says, you have to offer to sell it back to us first, and if we don't buy it, we will list it for sale. But it's through the park. So yeah. All right, so Beth is asking, when listing vacant land, is there anything you need to find out about the land prior to listing? Well, it would definitely be a good idea to find out. Mineral rights are just a huge topic even still today. So I would say it's always a great idea when you're listing vacant land of some substance, probably over an acre, 2 acres, depending upon the area. You probably want to figure out whether the landowner is offering mineral rights or not, because that could be very contentious. We just had a situation out at Lake Mohawk. It was a 0.16 lot size, right? So I mean, we're not talking about a huge property here. And I think it was priced just under 200,000 or just over, but nonetheless, the buyer, our purchase agreement says you're getting you're getting those rights, the mineral rights. And the seller told his agent he wasn't selling those mineral rights with it. So we got to the closing table and the seller refused to sign. Because he had told his agent that I was not selling the mineral rights with it, but our purchase agreement had it in there. They both missed it. The buyer and seller ended up agreeing that the seller could retain the mineral rights for 10 years and agreed to a purchase agreement after the 10 years and all that fun stuff. So they agreed to close. But that would have stopped the sale. So that to me is one of the biggest things I would say. If it's vacant land, check and make sure that the mineral rights do or do not convey, and I would put that in the broker remarks or in the public remarks, because especially, getting down towards Tappan, Leesville Lake area, whatever, people hunt on that land, but they also want it because of the gas and oil rights.
Do we have a form at all for mineral rights?
That would exclude mineral rights?
Well, just that we've seen a form specifically for mineral rights that we had a property listed, we have a property listed, and the offer came over and there was a separate sheet just for mineral right information.
I don't,
Yeah,
but I
I
would
think
say
it's-
share it with me.
Yeah,
I'm
I
happy to
think-
send it to our legal counsel and see if that's something that we should be doing as well. It would certainly stop those instances that we just ran into at the lake, where you had a seller that said that they weren't included, but our purchase agreement had them, because it would be a whole separate page, is what it sounds like from what you're saying.
Yeah, especially because down there they're putting a well pad in, so people are nuts.
Yeah.
I mean, people are
Yeah.
crazy, so,
And they may never get anything anyway.
yeah, they're not.
Yeah.
No,
That's why I said, on a
0.16
0.16
acre.
acre lot, I was
Yeah.
like, at the lake too, I was like, do you think that they're coming up on all those hills to get the gas all the way down? Probably
They'll pull
not,
it,
They're gonna
but
pull
it'll
it,
be fine.
but
You
they're
know,
not touching
like-
that property.
Usually right now, it's like 4,000 an acre that they're leasing it.
Yeah.
So 0.16, like seriously.
They were getting maybe
you're-
$1,000.
You're gonna
a
fight
year.
over
Yeah.
$1,000?
Yeah. That's kind of crazy. They did. All right, well,
Sorry,
any
sorry.
other, yes, thank you. Any other questions? Yes,
I did run into some areas have a architectural minimum for land if you're buying, that you gotta like build a house so big. And it's
Yep.
not always on the county's website. Would that be a zoning question?
it may not be a zoning question. You can check with zoning first. For those of you, if you didn't hear the question, is the Architectural Review Board is what it sounds like you're talking about on a minimum square footage for a house. A lot of times those are in the deed restrictions of a property if they put in a development. So it doesn't often, you don't often see that if it's, 40 acres of land and 60 acres of land or whatever. You typically see an architectural review board if it's in a development, because they want the house to be a minimum square footage. It might have to have stone on the front, it might have to have brick in the back, whatever the case is. It might have to have side load garages only, not front load. There are a lot of things, but that's an architectural review board. That would be the association enforcing those things. However, the developer could have put it in the deed restrictions. So you can either check the deed, you can check with the homeowners association, but zoning may or may not have it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. I think there was another question here. All right, when listing, would I contact zoning to confirm it is buildable, septic and well codes?
Don't know when I'll be back.
Yes, you can contact zoning to make sure it's buildable, but that doesn't guarantee.
Then I may have to client to hand over the keys.
As far as a septic and well, and they won't know that until they do a
Oh,
perk test
I don't know if I'll be back.
on the land, and typically the buyer does that. Now, if the seller wants to do all
Right.
that up front, great.
Love you.
Yeah, but typically you could only contact zoning and say, would a
think that
house
you
be
can
allowed to
email
be
me.
built on this lot? Well, the answer might be yes. That's
Okay.
great, but it doesn't mean
I
a
checked my email.
5,000 square foot house can be built on that lot. Maybe it's only based on the lot size, you can only
Bye-bye.
have, it has to be
I don't know.
10 foot from each side property line, and so that's gonna limit what the house looks like. So zoning can answer general questions to say, yes, you can build on that lot, but they're not gonna determine what you're building on that lot. That is typically gonna come down to the builder and where it's located. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. So this was not vacant land, but it was something that is going through the Ohio Supreme Court right now, which is kind of scary for all of us, to be very clear, because we are all real estate agents. What happened is an attorney decided that they were going to buy a property and tear it down. They were buying the land, they were buying the property for about $1 million. It's up on like the lake. I don't think it's Mentor, but it's somewhere up that way. And they were buying it. Well, there is a private sewer system that runs through this development for the development. It runs along the lake side of it, so not the street side, but along the backyards of these people's houses along there. The original seller, the owner of the property, said he was, the property disclosure form asks if you're aware of any easements or utility lines that run through the property. He was not aware that this particular sewer ran right through his backyard. He just never thought about it. It's private. It's not on any maps anywhere except for 1956 when the development was planned. That's the only place they could find it. So the city didn't have it. The sewer company didn't have it. There was nobody that had it, just this development. So the buyer thought they did all of their homework until they called the municipality or the HOA, and the HOA said, well, yeah, you can build a house, but you can't build a house where you're talking about building the house because the sewer line runs through there. And they were like, what are you talking about? The sewer line runs through there. So anyway, this buyer had offered $40,000 over the list price. Well, because he was an attorney, he decided that he was going to back out of the deal and felt that he was compelled to back out of the deal because he now had new information about where he wanted to build his house on this lot that he couldn't do it. So he didn't want to build it anymore. Well, it just so happened that the seller was also an attorney. And the seller said, no, you had all that time to do your inspections. It's on a 1956 development map that the sewer runs through there. I'm not obligated to tell you that either. It's all public record. Well, it's a public record, but it's buried in 1956 maps that nobody looked at. So unfortunately, the seller decided to sue the buyer for attorney fees and the extra $40,000 that he was going to get from this sale. Because the property, and I'm making up this particular number, but let's say it was listed at $1 million. In order to get it, the buyer offered $1,040,000. So the seller was like, oh, I'm getting $40,000 more. Well, when the deal fell through, he thought, well, I'm not getting that $40,000 anymore. I'm going to still sell the property and I'm going to sue the buyer for not performing because he had all the time in the world to do his due diligence and didn't find this 1956 map. Well, that went to the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court, went to a district court. A district court said, oh, well, based on this information, now that you have sued over it, we as a district court think that every homeowner in the state of Ohio must disclose every easement that's on their property and whether it's sewer, utility, whatever it is, you need to find out and you have to disclose it. That is your responsibility instead of caveat emptor, which is buyer beware, and have them do their diligence. So these attorneys, even though they got all of us into this mess, they contacted Ohio Realtors and asked us to write an amicus brief, which is basically a legal document that would either uphold the district courts or to try and change the mind of the district court, citing precedents throughout the state. Well, an amicus brief is not cheap. That was $20,000 to have that done. So we, as Ohio Realtors, we all paid for that to be done, hoping to fight what could end up being a law that comes through that says every seller in the state of Ohio must disclose, and it will be the agent and or the seller's responsibility to disclose all of that. Well, I mean, I'm not gonna look back at a 1956 map to have found a private sewer as a listing agent, and I bet if I'm the seller, I'm not doing it either. So we are trying to fight that, but I will tell you that you've got to be very careful when you're doing this vacant land that you understand where a buyer is putting their property as far as their house or their garage or their pool or whatever it is that they want. Make sure you're giving enough time to do due diligence for everything that you can possibly look at. Now, that's an extreme case. And those people had money owning $1 million house, right? They have money to sue each other and their legal services are free because they're both attorneys. So, but because of their feud, it could harm all future sellers and realtors to have to disclose information that we don't even have access to. So it's kind of scary. So we're hoping that that gets put away by the Supreme Court, but time will tell.
Well, like disclosing an easement is already in the property disclosure, right?
It
Like,
is if you know about it.
Right, so then you're responsible for what you don't know about.
Yes, that is exactly right. You're responsible for what you don't know, meaning that you as the seller and or listing agent have to find out what you don't know about the property and disclose all of that. And that is the problem, is a private easement is not anywhere, you can't find that anywhere. That was in, like I said, buried in a map that the development had when they did it, but public utilities didn't have that out there. That's what the seller was relying on is, oh, there's no sewer line that runs through there because public utilities don't have an easement through my property. Neither does the electric company or the gas company or anything, but there was by the homeowners association sewer. So again, it's kind of scary. Hopefully the Supreme Court takes the case and puts that to bed. Otherwise it could become law and precedent in the future. So it's amazing what we don't think we're gonna get ourselves into and end up getting ourselves into by helping and doing our best. So that's why I say do your due diligence, not to scare you, but just make sure, like I said, you know, a buyer's gonna be very upset if they can't build their house where they want it. So on the other inspections, you could always put something to like, subject to the builder verifying that the home can be in the spot the seller or the buyer wants it. You would probably, if you have a builder, that would be the other box you'd check, is it for inspections is, you know, builder approval. Specific on line 84, builder must approve lot and site of home acceptable to buyers' wants. So, because like I said, you could have 40 acres in the exact spot you want to build a house, you can't. So, all right, anything else? Good questions. All right, well then I'm gonna give you guys a day back. Thank you so much for your time today. You guys have a great day.
Thank you.